Whispers on the wind. The shovel bit into the earth with stubborn resistance, mirroring the ache that had taken root in Sarah's soul. Each shovelful widened the raw wound in the prairie, a physical manifestation of her loss. The wind, a relentless presence on this desolate plain, lashed strands of her hair across her face like icy whips, blurring her vision. Were those whispers she heard, or just phantoms spun from grief, mocking echoes of Tom's jovial voice, his heartfelt promises? She pressed on, the soil reluctant to yield, as if fighting the permanence of death. The cottonwood, a lonely sentinel rising from the sea of grass, offered the only solace. Tom had admired its tenacity, how it weathered every storm. A bright shard of memory pierced through the gloom. Tom's arm warm around her as they stood atop the rise, their wagon the vanguard of a new life. The prairie stretched before them, a verdant promise waiting to be fulfilled. "Our future, Sarah," he declared, his voice ringing with optimistic fervor. Now only dust devils danced where hope had bloomed. Sarah leaned heavily on the shovel, her muscles screaming in protest. The abyss yawned deep enough, yet still too shallow to contain her sorrow. Reluctantly, she lowered Tom's form into the earth, swaddled in his cherished quilt, a patchwork of love meticulously sewn by his mother. The fabric looked pathetically small against the enormity of loss. She smoothed the vibrant colors, murmuring a silent farewell, a vow to keep his memory alive. The first clod struck with a muffled thunk, a brutal punctuation mark. Every subsequent heave of earth was a nail hammered into the coffin of their shared existence. Tears tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks, a testament to her grief and arduous labor. Mechanically, she filled the hole, her limbs leaden, her heart a shattered vase. From scavenged branches, she constructed a rough-hewn cross, scrawling his name with charcoal, Thomas Walker. Beloved husband. A humble tribute, all she could muster. As the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Sarah knelt beside the raw earth, her hands clasped tight. From her satchel, she retrieved Tom's well-worn Bible, its pages softened with use and stained with memories. Within its leaves, he had always found sanctuary. She opened to the Psalms, her voice wavering as she recited, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The familiar cadence rang discordant, a bitter irony in her current state. She wanted everything, most of all, him. She yearned for the stolen future they had envisioned. A solitary tear splashed onto the sacred page. Yet she persisted, her voice gaining strength with each verse, the ancient words offering a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. When twilight had fully embraced the prairie, Sarah closed the Bible. The wind intensified, carrying the sharp scent of sage and the mournful song of the plains. Isolation pressed down, palpable and suffocating. Yet a flicker of defiance ignited within her. She would not surrender. She would not be swallowed by despair. She would endure. For Tom's sake and for her own. She rose, silhouetted against the fading light, her gaze sweeping the boundless expanse, the stoic cottonwood, the raw gash in the earth. This unforgiving land was now hers, her burden, and she would bear it with unwavering resolve, even as sorrow rode on the wind. Returning to the humble dugout, she left him to the prairie night, to the stars that bore silent witness to her grief. Sleep would be elusive, plagued by specters of the past. Yet, a conviction bloomed in her heart, a certainty that she would confront the dawn, ready to fight for her survival, ready to honor Tom's legacy. The storm's gift. The wind howled a mournful dirge, clawing at the small cabin. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the already desolate landscape into a gray, watery world. Sarah huddled by the hearth, the fire doing little to combat the chill that seeped into her bones, a chill deeper than the prairie winter. It was a bone-deep loneliness, a constant reminder of Tom's absence. The storm intensified. Lightning cracked, illuminating the cabin with brief, stark flashes followed by thunder that rattled the very foundations. Sarah jumped at a particularly loud clap, spilling her tea. As she bent to clean the mess, a different sound cut through the storm's fury, a low moan, almost swallowed by the wind. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. She strained to listen, dismissing it as the wind playing tricks. But then she heard it again, a ragged, pain-filled sound that couldn't be mistaken. Fear warred with a burgeoning sense of responsibility. Tom would have gone to investigate. Tom always helped. Grabbing Tom's old rifle, she pushed open the door, the wind instantly trying to rip it from her grasp. The rain was a brutal assault, plastering her hair to her face and soaking her clothes in seconds. Shielding her eyes, she scanned the immediate area. Nothing. Then, a flash of lightning revealed a figure sprawled near the woodpile, half hidden in the mud. A man. Sarah cautiously approached, the rifle held high. As she drew closer, she saw the dark, matted hair, the buckskin clothing torn and soaked. An Indian. Her breath hitched. She had heard stories, terrifying tales of Apache raids, of settlers murdered and homes burned. But this man, he wasn't raiding anything. He was injured, unconscious, at the mercy of the storm. Lowering the rifle slightly, she knelt beside him. He was young, his face lean and weathered even in unconsciousness. A deep gash ran across his temple and his breathing was shallow and ragged. Fear still lingered, but it was overshadowed by a wave of compassion. She couldn't leave him to die. Not out here, alone. Can you hear me? She shouted, her voice barely audible above the storm. No response. He was heavy. Far heavier than Tom had been. Sarah struggled to get him into a position where she could drag him, her muscles burning with the effort. She managed to loop one of his arms over her shoulders, bracing herself against the wind and rain. Each step was a battle. The mud sucked at her boots, and the wind threatened to throw them both to the ground. She stumbled, nearly losing her grip, but sheer determination kept her going. Inch by agonizing inch, she pulled him towards the cabin. Finally, they reached the doorway. Getting him inside was another ordeal. He was dead weight, and she strained against the doorframe, her arms screaming in protest. With a final surge of effort, she managed to heave him across the threshold, collapsing beside him on the floor, gasping for breath. The relative silence and warmth of the cabin was a welcome relief. Rainwater streamed from her hair and clothes, forming puddles on the wooden floor. She looked at the man lying beside her, his face pale and still. He was here now. In her home. An Apache warrior. And she was alone with him, with only the storm and the flickering fire for company. She had no idea what she was going to do, but one thing was certain. Her life had just taken another unexpected and potentially dangerous turn. A debt of honor. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls as Sarah knelt beside the prone figure of the Apache man. The storm still raged outside, a relentless percussion against the roof, but within the small space, a fragile stillness had taken hold. She dipped a clean rag into the lukewarm water she'd managed to heat over the embers, her hand trembling slightly. It wasn't just the cold, the sight of his wounds, raw and angry against his dark skin, churned her stomach. One gash, a jagged line across his left shoulder, looked particularly deep. She dabbed at the dried blood, wincing at the involuntary flinch that rippled through his body. He was unconscious still, but his brow furrowed in pain. Sarah tried to be as gentle as possible, murmuring soft, unintelligible sounds as if she could soothe him with her voice. The stench of stale blood and wood smoke filled the air, a stark reminder of the violence that had brought him here. Hours crawled by. The storm began to abate, its fury slowly dissipating into a steady rain. Sarah continued her vigil, changing the poultice she'd made from willow bark and applying it to his wounds. Exhaustion tugged at her, but she refused to succumb. He was her responsibility now. It was the groan that startled her awake. Sarah, who had been dozing fitfully in the chair beside him, jerked upright. Waxen Shadow's eyes were open, dark and unfathomable, like pools reflecting a starless night. He stared at her, unblinking, his expression unreadable. He tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath betrayed the pain that lanced through him. Sarah gently pushed him back down. "Stay still," she said, her voice hoarse. "You're injured." His gaze remained fixed on her, scrutinizing, assessing. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her words in any way. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions and simmering suspicion. Finally, he rasped, "Who are you?" His English was accented, rough around the edges, but clear. "Sarah," she replied, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Sarah Walker." He repeated her name, testing its sound on his tongue. Why am I here?" "I found you," Sarah explained, choosing her words carefully. "Near the creek. You were hurt." His eyes narrowed. "Hurt? More than hurt?" He touched his shoulder gingerly, a grimace etching itself onto his face. "Ambush." "Ambush?" Sarah echoed, her brow furrowing. Who would do that?" He didn't answer directly. "I was scouting. Looking for food. Game is scarce." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin, taking in the meager furnishings, the patched walls. "This is your home?" Sarah nodded. "It is." Another silence descended, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Waxen Shadows continued to study her, his eyes sharp and penetrating. He seemed to be weighing her, judging her intentions. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. "I am Apache." Sarah hesitated. She knew the stories, the fear and hatred that festered between the settlers and the Native Americans. But looking at him lying helpless in her cabin, she couldn't reconcile those stories with the man before her. "Because you needed help," she said simply. "Because it was the right thing to do." He searched her face as if looking for a lie. After a long moment, he seemed to find something that satisfied him. A flicker of something akin to respect perhaps softened his gaze. "I owe you a debt," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "A debt of honor. The price of fear." The rocker's squeak sawed through the silence, a counterpoint to Walk-in-Shadow's shallow breaths. Sarah hadn't closed her eyes. Outside, the pre-dawn sky bled a somber purple into the receding darkness, and a chill clung to the cabin despite the embers glowing in the hearth. The last of her willow bark had gone into his poultice, the bleeding had stopped, but the fever clung. A sudden shudder vibrated through the floor, not the familiar groan of settling timbers, but a deeper resonance that hummed in her very bones. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively seeking the rifle propped against the wall. Dust motes pirouetted in the meager light filtering through the window as the sound intensified. The approaching storm of horses' hooves. Many horses. She peered through the grimy pane. An ochre haze billowed on the horizon, birthing the silhouettes of riders. Jed Stone. Her gut twisted. What had held him up? She'd known he wouldn't ignore the vanished cattle, the furtive whispers of an Apache presence. Now she'd have to pay the cost of her mercy. Sarah moved swiftly, draping a blanket over Walk-in-Shadows. He whimpered, a low sound lost in the stillness. She stilled him with a hand on his shoulder, a silent entreaty. The drumming grew deafening, then fractured into absolute quiet outside the cabin. The ensuing hush crackled with threat. A fist slammed against the door, shaking its frail construction. "Sarah Walker, open up." Jed's voice echoed, magnified by the crisp morning air. "Open it now, or we're taking it down." Sarah inhaled deeply, struggling to control the tremor that racked her hands. She positioned the rifle within easy reach before drawing back the bolt. Jed Stone filled the doorway, a massive figure silhouetted against the nascent dawn. Behind him, a dozen men shifted on their mounts, their expressions hard-etched. His gaze, glacial and unwavering, swept the cabin, lingering on Sarah before flicking to the blanketed form on the bed. "We heard tell," Jed began, his voice a low rumble, "of an Apache renegade. Seen heading this direction." He shouldered past Sarah, his heavy boots striking the floorboards with dull thuds. His men followed, infiltrating the small space like a creeping shadow. "Jed, Sarah started, but he silenced her with a sharp gesture. "Quiet." He reached the bed and ripped the blanket aside. A stunned silence fell. Walk-in-Shadows lay exposed, his dark skin and braided hair a visual jolt against the homespun bedding. He remained unconscious, his face ashen and gaunt. Jed's face twisted with fury. He spun on Sarah, his eyes like burning coals. "What in God's name is this?" he bellowed, spraying spittle. "Sheltering a savage? Shielding a murderer?" Sarah stood firm, though her pulse hammered in her ears. "He was hurt. I found him near death's door." "And you saw fit to coddle him?" Jed spat the words. "An Apache? After all they've done? All they've stolen?" He expectorated on the floor near Walk-in-Shadow's still figure. "He needed aid," Sarah replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't leave him to rot." Jed's face transformed into granite. "You've made your choice, Sarah. Aiding and abetting a known enemy of the people. That's treason, plain and simple." He waved toward his men. "Take him. And her. Let the judge decide what becomes of a turncoat. A fight for survival." The ropes binding Walk-in-Shadows bit cruelly into his wrists. He lay still, a mask of impassivity on his face, but Sarah saw the flicker in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He was listening. Jed, puffed up with self-importance, was laying down the law. "Treason, Mrs. Walker. That's what you're looking at. Harboring a savage." Jed spat the word like a curse. "You'll swing for this." Sarah stood defiant, her weariness momentarily forgotten in a surge of anger. "He was injured. I offered him shelter. Is that a crime now?" Jed's face purpled. "Don't you sass me, woman. You're lucky I ain't dragged you both out back and strung you up already." He gestured to one of his men. "Get him up. We're taking him back to town. There'll be a trial. And you, Mrs. Walker, will be right there beside him." The man, a hulking brute with a greasy beard, reached for Walk-in-Shadows. That was when the world exploded. With the guttural roar that seemed to tear from the depths of his soul, Walksin Shadows surged upward. The brute, caught completely off guard, stumbled backward with a yelp as Walksin Shadows used his bound hands to slam into the man's chest. Jed swore, scrambling back. The other two men fumbled for their rifles. Sarah gasped, adrenaline flooding her system. Walksin Shadows, though weakened, moved with a ferocity she hadn't imagined. He kicked out, sending a stool flying into the face of one of Jed's men. The man crumpled, clutching his nose. Chaos erupted. Furniture crashed, dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight piercing the gloom, and the air filled with shouts and curses. Jed, his face contorted with rage, drew his pistol. "Kill him," he screamed. "Kill the goddamn savage." Sarah, momentarily paralyzed, snapped into action. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the hearth and swung it with all her might, connecting with the back of Jed's head. He staggered, the pistol falling from his grasp. "Run!" she yelled to Walksin Shadows, grabbing a knife from the table and slashing at the ropes binding his wrists. He was already moving, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He snatched the dropped pistol and fired, the shot deafening in the small space. It wasn't aimed to kill, but to create more pandemonium. The remaining conscious man hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. Walksin Shadows kicked him in the stomach, sending him sprawling. Sarah had freed his hands. "Go," she urged again, pushing him toward the back door. He didn't need telling twice. He was out the door and into the dense undergrowth before Jed could regain his senses. Sarah followed, grabbing her shawl and a small bag of dried meat and jerky. She glanced back at the cabin. Jed was on his knees, clutching his head, his face a mask of fury. "Walker!" he roared, his voice thick with hatred. "You haven't seen the last of me. I'll hunt you both down. You'll pay for this. I swear it." They plunged into the woods, the sounds of Jed's enraged threats echoing behind them. The trees offered a cool, green embrace, but Sarah knew it was a false comfort. They were fugitives now, with a relentless enemy on their trail. Walksin Shadows, still favoring his injured leg, moved with surprising speed. He led her through the dense undergrowth, his senses seemingly heightened, attuned to every rustle and snap. They moved deeper and deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind the only life Sarah had known, heading towards an uncertain future. The air grew cooler as they climbed higher into the hills. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. She risked a glance back. There was no sign of pursuit, but she knew Jed would be coming. He was not a man to be denied. They needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere safe. But in this vast, unforgiving land, safety was a rare and precious commodity. The warrior's proposal, the canyon's ruddy walls, etched with shades of ochre and rust, offered meager sanctuary from the sun's relentless assault. Sarah sought solace against the cool rock face, her breath ragged, a coppery taste of dread lingering at the back of her throat. Walksin Shadows sat nearby, ramrod straight despite the crimson bloom spreading across the makeshift bandage on his shoulder. The cotton ripped from her petticoat was a stark testament to their desperate flight. Since their harrowing descent, punctuated by the dull thud of Jed's collapsing form, he'd remained silent. The air now vibrated with unspoken accusations and the weight of their impossible predicament. "We need water," she croaked, her voice raspy. "And a less exposed refuge." Walksin Shadows inclined his head, his dark gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon. "There is a hidden spring further into the canyon's embrace, known only to a few." He shifted, a grimace flickering across his features. Sarah pushed herself upright, her muscles screaming in protest. "Can you manage?" "I will." He rose with a predator's measured grace, even wounded. They advanced slowly, the ground a mosaic of arid earth and thorny bushes. At last, they reached the spring. A slender stream seeped from a fissure in the rock, forming a small, crystalline pool. Sarah cupped her hands and drank deeply, the cool water a soothing balm to her parched throat. Walksin Shadows observed her with unwavering intensity. When she lowered her hands, she faced him, searching for answers in his stoic expression. "Why? Why betray me to Jed?" He met her questioning gaze. It was the truth as he demanded. "But you understood the consequences." "I knew," he affirmed simply. Sarah regarded him, a blend of frustration and a strange intuition swirling within her. He had resigned himself to his fate, perhaps even courted it. The way of a warrior, maybe. But it had ensnared her as well. He settled near the spring, his voice a low cadence. "You preserved my life, Sarah Walker. I couldn't stand by and watch him kill you," she murmured. Among my people, he continued, his expression unwavering, such a debt cannot be settled with trinkets or favors. Sarah furrowed her brow. What are you suggesting? He paused, his gaze inscrutable. The life debt, it necessitates more. His gaze drifted towards the jagged peaks in the distance. The woman who spares a warrior's life becomes his responsibility, his kin. Unease coiled in Sarah's stomach. Responsibility? In what sense? Walks in shadows turned back, his eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. It signifies marriage. The word hung, heavy and improbable. Sarah stared, her thoughts in disarray. Marriage? To him? An Apache warrior? Preposterous. Utterly impossible. You can't be serious, she finally choked out, her voice trembling. I am, he stated. It is the only path to ensure your safety. And mine. Protect us? She echoed, bewildered. From what perils? From Jed's vengeance. From the soldiers' interference. From the censure of your society and mine. As my wife, you exist under my shield. You become Apache. Jed will lose any claim. The soldiers, they would weigh their actions before harming the spouse of Walks in Shadows. Sarah's mind spun. It was lunacy. A forced union with a man she scarcely knew, immersed in a culture she couldn't begin to comprehend. Yet, in his unwavering gaze, she saw not cruelty but a desperate conviction. He truly believed this was the only recourse. And perhaps in this harsh, unforgiving land, he was right. But, I don't grasp, she stammered. Why would you offer this? You know nothing about me. I know you spared my life, he countered. That is sufficient. And you possess a strength, Sarah Walker, a spirit of courage. Qualities that command admiration. He reached, his hand hovering near hers. Reflect on it, he said softly. Ponder my proposition. Our very survival may depend upon it. An unlikely union. The words cloyed, thick and stifling as the desert air itself. Marriage. To Walks in Shadows. A stranger. A man whose tongue was foreign. Pulled from a world beyond her ken. Sarah slumped onto her cot. The coarse blanket a rasp against her skin. Jed and his posse were a grim certainty, hounds on her trail. Alone, she was a lamb for slaughter. Walks in Shadows offered sanctuary, a bulwark crafted from the very culture Jed sought to erase. But at what sacrifice? Her mind conjured Thomas's visage. That tender smile, the laughter lines etched beside his eyes. Could she defile his memory so? Surrender herself to another, even in pretense? But Thomas, a soul of peace and empathy, wouldn't wish her demise. He'd risked all for others. Surely he grasped that this wasn't about affection but bare survival. She opened her eyes to find Walks in Shadows watching, his dark gaze inscrutable. He hadn't stirred from his post, a silent guardian within the cramped cabin. I can't say, she breathed, voice raspy. I require deliberation. A slight inclination of his head, a concession almost unseen. Time is a boon we lack. He was correct. Each wasted breath brought Jed that much closer. With effort, she met his stare. Very well, she conceded, the word fragile as spun glass. I accept. A flicker of relief crossed his features, immediately veiled by his customary stoicism. He simply nodded, then turned, moving towards the doorway. He raised a hand, unleashing a sharp, guttural call that reverberated across the valley floor. Paralyzed, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Figures materialized from the rocky landscape and sparse brush, Apache warriors, faces adorned with ochre and ebony paint, bodies honed and sinewy. Women followed, their movements possessed a lithe grace, their eyes probing and sharp. Children peered from behind their mothers, a blend of curiosity and unease etched on their young faces. They moved with a quiet authority and intrinsic understanding of the terrain that heightened her own displacement. A mosaic of bronze skin and dark eyes, they stood in stark contrast to her pallor and the familiar azure of her dress. Nalim, an elder whose face was creased like the arid ravines around them, approached Sarah. Though aged, her eyes burned with keen intelligence and a surprising tenderness. She wore a simple buckskin dress, embellished with elaborate beadwork. Nalin surveyed Sarah with a slow, measuring appraisal, her expression unreadable as ancient glyphs. Finally she spoke, her voice a low, resonant cadence. Walks in Shadows translated, she perceives the sorrow within your heart. Yet she also recognizes strength. Sarah, stripped bare by the woman's gaze, remained mute. Preparations commenced with brisk efficiency. The women set about cleansing the cabin, sweeping out dust and webs, their actions fluid and silent. Others gathered kindling and coaxed a blaze to life outside. 2 girls set to work grinding corn on a broad, flat stone. Nalin gestured towards Sarah's meager possessions. Her wedding gown, carefully stored for a future now forfeit, remained untouched within the trunk. Nalin lifted a simple white shawl, a gift from Thomas, its delicate lace a sharp counterpoint to the rough-hewn buckskin around her. She held it aloft, questioning in her gaze. Walks in Shadows spoke to her in Apache, eliciting a slow nod. She draped the shawl over Sarah's shoulders, the soft texture a meager solace against the looming unknown. As the sun dipped below the horizon, streaking the firmament with ribbons of coral and violet, the preparations concluded. The air thrummed with the sense of wood smoke and roasting venison. The Apache assembled in a circle, faces illuminated by the dancing firelight. Sarah stood beside Walks in Shadows, feeling adrift from all that had defined her life. This improbable alliance, forged in desperation and survival, teetered on the precipice of its genesis. New beginnings, old ways. The sun bled crimson and gold across the western peaks as the wedding began. Sarah stood stiffly in the center of the clearing, the unfamiliar buckskin dress heavy on her shoulders. Nalin had insisted on it, a gesture of acceptance, she supposed, though the rough leather chafed against her skin. Around her, the Apache were a swirl of color, vibrant turquoise beads, intricate feathered headdresses, and painted faces illuminated by the flickering flames of a large bonfire. The air thrummed with the rhythmic beat of drums, and the high, keening voices of the women singing a song she couldn't understand. Walks in Shadows stood beside her, a stoic figure carved from granite. His gaze, usually so intense, was fixed on the fire. She hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to him since agreeing to the marriage. He was a stranger, bound to her by circumstance, not affection. Nalin, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by time and wisdom, began to chant in Apache, his voice resonating with the power of the mountains. He circled them, scattering pinches of sacred pollen, the sweet scent momentarily masking the smoky odor of the fire. Sarah watched, trying to decipher the meaning behind the ritual, but the language and the customs were a closed book to her. She felt a pang of grief for Thomas, for the simple church wedding they had planned, for the life that had been stolen from her. The ceremony continued, a series of unfamiliar gestures and pronouncements. Walks in Shadows placed a woven belt around her waist, symbolizing their union. She barely registered the touch of his hand, rough and calloused, as he secured it. When Nalin finally declared them husband and wife, the Apache erupted in cheers, the sound echoing through the valley. Sarah managed a weak smile, the gesture feeling foreign and forced. Life as Walks in Shadows' wife began the next morning with the rising sun. She woke in his wickiup, a small, dome-shaped dwelling constructed of bent branches and hides. The air inside was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something wild, something undeniably Apache. He was already gone, vanished into the dawn like a phantom. She ventured outside, blinking against the bright sunlight. The women were already at work, grinding corn, tending to the children, mending clothes. They paused in their tasks as she approached, their eyes sharp and assessing. Some offered curt nods, others averted their gaze, whispering amongst themselves. The distrust was palpable, a cold wind that cut through her thin skin. An older woman, her face etched with the same lines of wisdom as Nalin, approached Sarah. Her name was Chaitin, and she was Walks in Shadows' mother. She gestured towards a pile of clay pots. "Water needs carrying from the creek," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind. Sarah, grateful for a task, however mundane, nodded and picked up a pot. The weight was considerable and she stumbled slightly as she made her way towards the creek. Laughter rippled behind her and she flushed with shame. She was clumsy, inept, a pale imitation of an Apache woman. The creek was cool and refreshing and she knelt to fill the pot, the water reflecting her own troubled face. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle hands and easy smile. How would he feel about all this? Would he understand why she had done what she had done? As she struggled to carry the heavy pot back to the village, a young girl, no older than 10, ran past her, effortlessly balancing a similar pot on her head. Sarah watched, envy and despair washing over her. She would never belong here. She was an outsider, a stranger in a strange land, bound to a man she barely knew, living a life she never could have imagined. The whispers and stares followed her, a constant reminder of her alien status. New beginnings, indeed, but built upon the crumbling foundation of her old life, and cemented with the harsh, unforgiving mortar of survival. Learning to listen. The sun beat down on the small clearing where Nalin knelt, her wrinkled hands gently parting the leaves of a low-growing plant. Sarah watched, perched awkwardly on a nearby rock, the coarse wool of her new dress scratching against her skin. It was a far cry from the soft cottons she'd once favored. This, Nalin said, her voice raspy but clear, is bear root. Good for stomach sickness. You chew small piece like this. She demonstrated, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she offered a piece to Sarah. Hesitantly, Sarah took it, the earthy smell filling her nostrils. It tasted bitter, almost acrid, but she swallowed it down, remembering the churning in her own stomach these past few days. Thank you, she managed. Nalin nodded, her gaze sweeping over the surrounding landscape. The land provides, but we must listen to it. Understand its voice. Sarah frowned. Its voice. The wind whispers secrets, Nalin explained, gesturing with a gnarled finger towards the rustling leaves of a nearby cottonwood. The stones hold memories. The water sings of life. You must learn to hear. Sarah spent the next several days shadowing Nalin, learning the names of plants she'd previously dismissed as weeds, discovering their healing properties, their uses for dyes and crafting. She learned to identify animal tracks, to tell the difference between the call of a hawk and an eagle, to predict the weather by the color of the sky at sunset. One afternoon, she found herself drawn to the edge of the camp, watching the Apache hunters return. They moved with a grace and precision that both fascinated and intimidated her. Shadows was among them, his face impassive as he carried a deer slung across his shoulders. His dark eyes flickered towards her for a brief moment, then quickly moved away. The women of the tribe swarmed around the hunters, their knives flashing as they expertly butchered the deer. Sarah watched, feeling a pang of guilt. Back home, meat came neatly packaged from the butcher. Here, it was a hard-won prize, a testament to the hunter's skill and the tribe's collective survival. Later, as she helped prepare the evening meal, Sarah found herself sitting beside a woman named Chaska who was meticulously scraping the hide of a rabbit. Chaska had been one of the most openly hostile towards her since the wedding. Back east, Sarah began hesitantly. We had stores. You could buy anything you needed. Chaska grunted, not looking up. We have the land. But what about things you can't grow or hunt? Like sugar? Or cloth? Chaska finally met her gaze, her eyes sharp. We trade. With other tribes. Sometimes with the white eyes. A flicker of anger crossed her face. But they take more than they give. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding dawning. The Apache weren't just surviving, they were fighting for their way of life, for their land, against a relentless tide of encroaching settlers. She thought of Thomas, his dreams of building a life in this new land, and a fresh wave of grief washed over her. My husband, she said softly, surprising herself with the vulnerability in her voice, he was a carpenter. He built houses, furniture. Chaska paused in her work, her expression softening slightly. He made things with his hands. Yes, Sarah replied. He loved the smell of wood. He said it reminded him of his father. They sat in silence for a moment. The only sound the crackling of the fire and the gentle murmur of voices around them. Then, Chaska spoke again, her voice low. My father was a weaver. He made blankets so beautiful they told stories. Sarah looked at her. A flicker of connection passing between them. Perhaps, she thought, understanding wasn't impossible. Even here, in this strange and unfamiliar world. Perhaps, by listening, truly listening, she could find her place. A seed of affection. The desert sun hammered down, blurring the horizon with phantom lakes. Sarah, under Nalin's tutelage, strained to identify sustenance among the thorny scrub. A sudden agitation in the nearby foliage prickled the back of her neck. Nalin stiffened, her hand instinctively hovering near her ever-present blade. A split second later, a javelina exploded from the undergrowth, wickedly sharp tusks glinting. Paralyzed, Sarah felt her breath catch. Never had she faced such raw aggression. Then, a figure blurred into motion. Shadows, back from an earlier hunt, intercepted the enraged beast, his hunting knife a streak of reflected sunlight. A primal bellow ripped from his throat as he met the javelina's charge. A brutal ballet of snorts, grunts, and scrabbling hooves filled the air. Sarah could only watch, pulse hammering, as Shadows grappled with the animal, displaying a savage strength she hadn't suspected. With a final, decisive lunge, he stilled the creature. Standing, his chest heaving, the knife now darkly stained, he raked her with a concerned gaze, a silent inventory of any harm. Only when assured of her safety did his taut muscles begin to loosen. Later, by the flickering light of their wickiup, Sarah discovered a long, angry tear on his forearm, courtesy of the javelina's tusk. He bore it with stoic silence, his expression unreadable as she cleansed the wound with water and Nalin's herbal remedies. "This needs stitching," she murmured, the words barely audible. She hadn't handled a needle and thread since. "William." The familiar pang of grief threatened, but she ruthlessly suppressed it, focusing on the task. Walks in Shadows simply inclined his head. He remained motionless as Sarah, using a sliver of bone sharpened to a point and a thread of sinew, meticulously closed the rent in his skin. Her fingers brushed against his flesh, radiating heat even beneath the grime. He remained unflinching, mute, yet she glimpsed a flicker within the depths of his eyes, not pain, but recognition. Her cheeks warmed as she lowered her gaze to her task. Days bled into weeks. Sarah continued her education with Nalin, deepening her appreciation for the Apache's intimate connection to the land. She found solace in the steady rhythm of their existence, the constant awareness of the surrounding world. One evening, while repairing a rip in Walks in Shadow's tunic, Sarah recounted William's disastrous attempts to train their dog, Buster, to hunt rabbits. Walks in Shadows, wetting his arrows, paused, a subtle curve appearing at the corner of his lips. "The dog preferred butterflies?" he queried, his voice a deep resonance. Laughter bubbled from Sarah, light and untainted. "He did." William was beside himself. Declared Buster valued beauty over sustenance. A low chuckle rumbled from Walks in Shadows, a sound that startled Sarah with its unexpected warmth. Perhaps the dog possessed wisdom. A comfortable quiet descended between them, punctuated only by the crackling fire and the distant lament of a coyote. Sarah studied Walks in Shadows, truly seeing him for the first time. No longer merely her protector, or the man she was obligated to marry, but a person. She noticed the resolve etched into his jawline, the quiet perception gleaming in his eyes, the subtle crinkles around his mouth that hinted at hardships endured. She also perceived a vulnerability that echoed her own inner landscape. Later, lying parallel on their sleeping mats, sleep evaded her. The memory of his courageous intervention against the javelina played out in her mind. He had risked everything for her, a stranger, a symbol of the forces threatening his people. "Why?" She shifted, facing him. His eyes were wide, fixed on the thatched roof of the wickiup. "Walks in Shadows," she breathed. He turned, his gaze locking with hers. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you shield me from the javelina?" He hesitated, as if carefully selecting his words. "You are my wife," he stated finally. "It is my responsibility." Sarah knew the explanation was incomplete. She detected something else in his expression, something transcending obligation, a feeling that stirred a warmth within her, a sensation she hadn't experienced in what felt like an eternity. A nascent seed of affection, delicate and new, was beginning to take root in the arid terrain of her heart. The gathering storm. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, mirroring the unease swirling within Sarah. The healing poultice on Walks in Shadows' shoulder smelled faintly of wood smoke and crushed herbs, a constant reminder of the javelina attack and the unexpected tenderness that followed. Today, though, the scent was overshadowed by fear. Two young scouts, faces etched with grim tidings, knelt before Walks in Shadows. Their words, delivered in rapid Apache, painted a stark picture. "Stone," one said, his voice low and urgent. "He returns. Many riders. Wagons. Guns." The air in the small clearing seemed to thicken. The women, who had been mending clothes and preparing food, froze. Children, sensing the shift in mood, clung to their mother's skirts. Walks in Shadows rose, the movement stiff, a flicker of pain crossing his face. He spoke a few clipped words to the scouts, then turned to his warriors already gathering their weapons. The efficiency of their preparations was chilling. There were no wasted movements, no panicked shouts, only a silent understanding of what was to come. Sarah watched, her stomach twisting. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the survival of this community, this way of life. She pushed through the crowd, reaching Walks in Shadows just as he was strapping on his leather arm guards. "Walks in Shadows, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "There has to be another way. Talking, anything to avoid this." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a weariness in them she hadn't seen before, a resignation that frightened her. "Stone does not talk. He takes. But so much bloodshed, so many lives lost." She reached for his hand, her fingers closing over the rough leather. "Can't you send someone? Offer something? Anything to make him leave." He gently pulled his hand away. We have offered him nothing but respect. He wants what he cannot have. He looked past her, his gaze hardening as he surveyed his warriors. We will defend our home. Nalin approached, her face lined with concern. She placed a hand on Sarah's arm. Come, she said softly. The women are preparing the shelters. We must move the children. Sarah shook her head, refusing to be led away. But what about you? You'll be fighting. She looked at Walks in Shadows, desperately searching for a flicker of hope. He met her gaze unflinchingly. We will do what we must. He turned and walked towards the edge of the village, where the warriors were forming a line of defense. The sun glinted off the tips of their spears, turning them into a wall of shimmering steel. Sarah watched him go, a knot of despair tightening in her chest. Jed was coming, fueled by hatred and greed. He wouldn't listen to reason. He would only see savages, obstacles to be crushed. Nalin tugged at her arm again. Sarah, come. You cannot change what is to be. But you can help protect the children. Reluctantly, Sarah allowed herself to be led away. As she walked, she could hear the rhythmic chanting of the warriors, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the ground and into her bones. It was a song of defiance, a promise of resistance. But beneath the strength, she could also hear the mournful undercurrent, the knowledge that some of them would not survive the coming storm. Between two worlds. The reek of pyre residue coated Sarah, a grim perfume as she adjusted the makeshift truce banner, a frayed remnant of her bedsheet lashed to a supple willow branch. Walks in Shadows had observed her preparations, his expression a stoic mask. He hadn't intervened, yet the tight line of his mouth betrayed his conviction. Conflict was inevitable, blood would stain the earth. She refused to concede. As the sun crested the horizon, it stretched her shadow grotesquely long as she trudged toward Jed's encampment. Each footfall on the parched ground amplified in the oppressive quiet, a metronome counting down to disaster. Her pulse surged, a frantic tattoo against the silence. The rankness of the camp assailed her nostrils even before it came into view, a pungent blend of sweat, horse flesh, and unwashed bodies. It was a suppurating sore on the pristine landscape. Haphazardly erected tents dotted the area amidst which men lounged, rifles casually held, their faces set in hardened lines. They noticed her almost instantly, weapons were raised, curt commands barked. Belay that. Jed's voice, gravelly and steeped in suspicion, sliced through the commotion. He emerged from the largest tent, his imposing form casting a deep shadow. His eyes, sharp as obsidian shards, scrutinized her. Sarah, he drawled, the name thick with contempt. What in God's name do you think you're playing at? She lifted the white flag higher, her grip surprisingly steady. I want to parley, Jed. I want to explore a way to prevent slaughter. He scoffed, a harsh expulsion of air. Those heathens deserve what's coming to them. And you, for siding with them, deserve the same. They're not savages, Jed. They're people with families with a claim to this place. Claim? This land belongs to those with the grit to tame it, Sarah. Something they lack. You've grown soft, living among them. A gob of spittle landed inches from her boots. You've forgotten your loyalties. I haven't forgotten anything, she countered, her tone gaining purchase. I recall neighborly compassion, the comfort of community. I remember common decency. Something you seem to have mislaid. Jed's face blotched crimson. Don't you dare preach decency to me, you turncoat. You've betrayed your own. I've betrayed no one. I offered assistance to those in need. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? She advanced a step, meeting his gaze squarely. Jed, there's room enough for all. We don't need to spill blood. We can negotiate coexistence. He barked out a laugh, a grating noise that vibrated through her. Share? With them? They'll pilfer our livelihoods. They'll torture homesteads, butcher our kin. They're predators, Sarah. And you're a damn fool if you can't see it. I know them, Jed. They're not predators. They're defending hearth and home, their traditions. Can't you grasp that? I grasp that you've been ensnared by their pagan ways, that you've forsaken everything you once cherished. He indicated his men who watched with undisguised animosity. Get out, Sarah. Scram back to your savage mate. You're not welcome here anymore. She held her ground, her hope ebbing with each passing heartbeat. Just consider it, Jed. Consider the lives that will be squandered. The families shattered. Is it truly worth the cost? His eyes narrowed, hardening into implacable stone. It's always worth it, Sarah. Always. He pivoted, striding back toward his tent, dismissing her with a perfunctory wave. Get off my property. Defeated, Sarah turned and started the trek back toward the Apache settlement. The white flag hung limp in her grasp, burdened by the weight of her failure. The sun bore down, an unwelcome reminder of the fellowship she once knew, a warmth now extinguished. Nearing the village, she spotted Walks in Shadows awaiting her at the edge of the trees. His face was an enigma, but his eyes held the question she dreaded. She offered a slow shake of her head, her heart leaden with disappointment and pain. The clash was nigh. Inescapable. A fragile peace. The dawn exploded with a rifle's sharp report, tearing the morning's quiet to shreds. Jed. The parley, a fool's game revealed. Bedlam swallowed the village. Lead whizzed, a deadly rain punctuated by the Apache's savage cries. Sarah's head swam. Terror, a glacial shard, pierced her calm. Nalin, worry twisting her features, hurried the children toward the sanctuary of the cliffside caves. Walks in shadows, a whirlwind of focused energy, commanded the chaos. His Apache booming, a resonant force cutting through the din, he deployed warriors behind protective boulders, directing their counterfire with lethal accuracy. Sarah, recalling the land from her gardening days, flagged hidden pathways Jed's men might exploit. The arroyo, she shouted to Walks in shadows, pointing to the dry wash that coiled around their settlement. They'll hug the ground for cover. A curt nod, his gaze acknowledging her contribution without wavering, and he sent several braves, silent as desert phantoms, to intercept the encroaching settlers. The fight became a churning vortex. The air, thick with the bitter reek of gunpowder and the coppery taste of blood, stung the nostrils. Sarah felt distanced, almost a detached observer to the brutality. Yet the raw animal urge to live flared within. Then she saw him. Jed, face a mask of rabid fury, breaching their defensive line. His rifle centered on Walks in shadows, who was momentarily preoccupied orchestrating the defense. Instinct overriding thought, Sarah hurled herself forward, knocking Walks in shadows aside. The slug intended for him ripped through her upper arm. An eruption of agony, hot and blinding, consumed her. A primal bellow tore from Walks in shadows, raw sound of unleashed wrath. He slammed into Jed, disarming him in a flash. A brutal brawl erupted, a savage dance of fists and desperate grunts. Fueled by venom, Jed fought with feral abandon. But Walks in shadows, protecting the woman who had unknowingly claimed his heart, battled with the ferocity of a cornered cougar. Finally, the sickening thud of bone on bone as Walks in shadows brought the rifle but down on Jed's skull. He crumpled lifeless. The remaining settlers, seeing their leader vanquished, crumbled too. They broke, scattering back across the plains, abandoning their fallen comrades. Silence descended, a suffocating blanket. Sarah lay sprawled, her arm a furnace of pain, watching smoke dissipate into the vast sky. Walks in shadows knelt beside her, his expression a taut landscape of concern. He tore a strip from his garment, binding her wound with practiced efficiency. His touch, surprisingly delicate, betrayed a tenderness he rarely displayed. Why, he rasped, his voice gravelly. Why would you do that? Sarah met his gaze, her eyes reflecting a weariness that transcended the physical. Because, she whispered, her voice fragile, I couldn't let him take you from this world. The battle concluded. The village secured, but the victory left a bitter residue. Sarah knew this was but a skirmish in a longer war. Jed's poison ran deep, contaminating the land, and it would take more than one victory to purge it. Jed, bound and held in the village's heart, was a broken man. The malice still smoldered in his gaze, but his arrogance had died, replaced by a bleak resignation. In the subsequent days, Sarah and Walks in shadows worked tirelessly. Sarah, despite the injury, used her linguistic skills to parley with those settlers willing to listen, to understand. Walks in shadows, with his quiet fortitude, steadied his people. A tenuous peace began to unfurl. A peace forged from exhaustion, from collective loss, and a fragile hope for a gentler future. It was a peace vulnerable to the slightest tremor, yet a crucial starting point. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Walks in shadows, Sarah surveyed the village. The setting sun bled across the horizon, igniting the clouds in fiery hues. The air hung still, fragrant with wood smoke and the earthy scent of the land. She felt rooted here, bound to these people in a way that defied language and origin. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with peril, with trials, betrayals, and moments of crippling despair. But she also knew she wasn't alone in taking this path. Walks in shadows stood beside her, his steadfastness a constant reassurance. And perhaps, just perhaps, together they could cultivate a future from the devastation.